before, from about the late 1970s, as I said, there's quite a large personal element to this story, as it were. From about the late 1970s, which was roughly when I was beginning to pay attention to what was going on in the newspapers and in the political debate, to about 1997, when the Blair Labour government was elected. Immigration wasn't really that much of a big political issue. There had been a very virulent but mercifully brief eruption of anti-immigrant and very specifically racist politics in this country from the early to the mid-70s. But that essentially ended with the election of Margaret Thatcher, who imposed a fairly restrictive immigration policy, but more or less it took it off the agenda as a political issue. Immigration policy was not a major topic of dispute between the main political parties during this period. And when immigration policy or immigration did rise up the political agenda, it was very much seen through, not through an economic lens at all. People didn't think about the economics of immigration, they thought about about racial and social issues. Economics really didn't enter into it. There were relatively few economists working on immigration, or the economics of immigration at that time. And really there was almost no quantitative analysis of the impact of immigration on the UK economy. And I discovered this when I was, almost by chance, when I returned to this country from New York in 1999, and I went to the Cabinet Office for the first time. I was commissioned to do a project within the Cabinet Office on the big social and political challenges facing the United Kingdom for the next 20 years. We had a team of about 3.5 people looking at this, so it was inevitably a fairly cursory look at an exercise in what is sometimes called horizon scanning. And a number of the issues that came up were, I think, relatively unsurprising at the time, let alone in retrospect, things like climate change or the impact of demographic change in the aging society. But one of the things which our analysis threw up was immigration, which was really something that nobody inside or outside government had really thought of as being a significant, likely to become a significant issue in the UK over the next 20 years. It wasn't really very much on the political agenda back in 1999, as I said, it certainly wasn't really on the agenda of most economists. So we managed to get ourselves commissioned to do a follow-up study on the economic and social impacts of immigration in the UK. A study which we completed every year or so and was eventually published under the title Migration and Economic and Social Analysis. And I think this was the first time really that anyone had looked at the impact of migration on the UK other than through the frame of race or racial politics. It was the first attempt to look at what the impact of immigration was and was likely to be on the UK economy. And now, because there wasn't much quantitative economic analysis at that time, it was mostly descriptive. We simply tried to pull together the available data on how many immigrants there were, what trends in immigration had looked like, how immigration patterns had changed, what the obvious first-order economic impacts of immigration was in terms of what occupations immigrants were working in, what sectors they were working in, and so on. And one interesting thing was that even given the lack of economic analysis, even just by looking at the data which no one had previously looked at, it was possible to say some things which really came as quite a surprise to the politicians and to commentators more widely at that time. So we established, for example, that immigrants in the UK, on average, had rather higher wages than natives, which was not something that was generally known, and contrasted to the experience of some other countries. That immigrants in the UK, on the whole, had higher skill levels or educational qualifications, and perhaps more importantly, we identified a number of factors why we thought immigration would be considerably more important in the 10 or 20 years following 2000 to the UK economy than it was in the 10 or 20 years preceding 2000, and that certainly is something that has been vindicated by subsequent events. And I think the production and the publication of this analysis had a pretty significant impact on government policy. That final sentence there is a quote from a review of the record of the first 10 years of the Labour government, produced by the Institute for Public Policy Research. There is no question that there was a major change in the UK's immigration policy around the late 90s. It wasn't solely due to this report by any means, or indeed to economic analysis more generally. To some extent, we were pushing in an open door. But there was very much a significant change in policy at around that time. And so, subsequent to the publication of our report, the early 2000s were really a period of very rapid policy development within government on immigration policy, particularly focused around the economic aspects of the migration system. So the first big change was reform and liberalisation of the work permit system, the system by which skilled workers can enter the UK from outside the European Union. The system was streamlined. It was made much easier for businesses to apply and to get work permits for people coming from abroad. And there was a corresponding very sharp rise in the number of people who came from abroad through that system in the early 2000s. The numbers pretty much quadrupled over a period of about 5 years, quite an extraordinary rise. The introduction of the highly skilled migrant program, which for the first time allowed people from outside the European Union to come to the UK without a firm job or job offer, simply on the basis of their skills or qualifications. Again, quite an important innovation. Third, the rapid expansion of the number of international students in this country, which is very much driven by the university sector and the sector's need and dependence on international students. Evidence of which I suspect can be found in this room. I don't think if I'd come here 20 years ago, the characteristics of the students would be exactly what they are today. And that in turn reflects this quite sharp change. This was something that was very much driven by the university sector itself, but facilitated by government policy, and in particular by the introduction of something called the post-study work route, which would enable students who came here from abroad to study to stay on after they'd taken their degree and work for a year or two, and in many cases indeed to stay on for longer than that. And then finally, and most importantly and most controversially, was access to the UK labour market for nationals of the A8. That's the eight of the 10 member states that joined the European Union in 2004. Most importantly for these purposes, Poland, but also the Baltic states, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and so on. So the UK took the decision to give nationals of those member states immediate access to the UK labour market rather than waiting for 3 or 5 or 7 years as some other countries, some other big European Union countries did. So that was a particularly important decision. A myth has sort of grown up around that the decision was based on a forecast by my colleague Christian Dustman at University College London, that only a relatively small number of A8 nationals would actually come to this country. It's undeniably true that the flows were indeed much larger than anticipated, either in Christian's paper or by the government. But actually there were three key drivers for the government's decision in that time. There was quite an important political impetus, and it's important not to forget that immigration policy throughout this period was driven by politics just as much as by economics. There was a political impetus driven in particular by the fact that one of the main reasons these countries had been admitted to the European Union in the first place was the very strong support given by the British government, both the then Labour government and its Conservative predecessors, for entry by the former states which had formerly been members of the Soviet bloc. It was seen very much in the UK's interest to have Poland and these other countries within the EU. Certainly looking at the debate today, it is actually quite bizarre to see how we have managed, or the current government has managed to, the current political debate presents the entry of these countries and the corresponding opening of our labour market to workers from these countries as somehow something that's unexpected or bad. In fact, it was very much a deliberate objective of UK government policy under both parties to get these countries in, partly because they were seen as a potential counterweight to the Franco-German axis that was seen to dominate the European Union. So this was the first. The second was an administrative and practical imperative. The UK has a very open and flexible labour market with relatively low levels of regulation. We don't really have a labour inspectorate to speak of, unlike some other countries who don't have identity cards. So, from one point of view, allowing people from these countries to come here and work legally was simply a matter of practicalities. If they hadn't come here legally, they would have come here illegally, and most of us thought that would be worse. But then finally there was a strong economic and labour market imperative. The UK labour market was doing well, unemployment was low, the economy was racing ahead. The general view was that the labour market and economic labour market impacts of people coming here from Eastern Europe would on the whole be beneficial. However, since then, of course, the pendulum, I've just described how inspired by generally an economic perspective, we liberalised immigration policy very substantially over the 5 or 6 years, first 5 or 6 years of the last government. Beginning in about 2004, 2005, the pendulum began very much to swing back. In large part because of the unexpectedly large numbers of Eastern Europeans who arrived here in 2004, the political climate in the UK became very much more negative towards immigration. And that was reflected both in public opinion, it was reflected along some parts of the political spectrum. And the result has been sort of swing back towards a considerably more restrictive immigration policy. So in 2007, when 2 more countries joined the European Union, the UK did not give immediate labour market access for people coming from Bulgaria and Romania. Instead, we imposed the full 7 years of restrictions before they finally were allowed in freely on January the 1st of this year. In 2008, the Labour government introduced what is called the points-based system for skilled workers, which was somewhat more restrictive than its predecessor, the work permit system, and since then has been steadily tightened up. When this government came to power, the coalition government, things were tightened up very considerably even further. The Conservative pledged to reduce net immigration to the tens of thousands, something which they've come a very long way from achieving. But in order to try and get some way to that objective, there were a considerable number of restrictions were imposed. In particular, there was a cap on the number of people coming through the skilled worker route of the points-based system called Tier 2. Supposedly, there's a fixed number of people who can come in any one year. They ended the post-study work route for students who wanted to stay on after completing their study. It's now much more difficult for students to stay on. They introduced a number of restrictions on the family migration route. That's for people who marry, typically people who marry British citizens and want to come here to live. It has to also be said, and that's one of the things underlying the fact that net immigration in this country is still well over 200,000 at the moment, that these, what appear to be very draconian restrictions on immigration, were also mitigated by other less visible changes. And this, I think, reflects the continual tension at the heart of government between the forces of control who want to restrict immigration and those within government who argue from a more economic perspective and tend to have a more liberal approach. So other changes were introduced which made it at least feasible for some people to circumvent these various restrictions. So immigration has not fallen by nearly as much as might have been expected back in 2010. So, and here we have the most recent numbers. So these are the immigration statistics that were actually published last Thursday. So they're the most recent statistics, only about 4 days old. And they do give quite a reasonable picture of what happened over the last 15 years and how policy has actually driven the flows. So you can see up until the mid-90s, people from outside the EU was relatively, was relatively constant, dipped up and down at about 50,000 a year. And then in the late 90s, driven both by the economics and by the policy change, it really took off. So this huge rise in net immigration from outside the EU. Similarly, we were roughly in balance with the European Union until 2004. So that is the point at which we opened our labour markets to Eastern Europe, and this is what's happened since. And here again, you can see what happened in 2010, which is that the changes introduced by the coalition had the immediate impact of reducing migration from outside the European Union. But as the economy has recovered, as various minor changes have been introduced to loosen the restrictions, and as people get used to the system, those numbers have started going up again. At the same time, economic forces, the recession in the continuing recession in the Eurozone, the entry of Bulgaria and Romania have all conspired to push net migration from outside the European Union up again. So these are the latest figures. They're not drawn up on the line because they're still provisional and they'll be revised a bit. But reasonably, that probably is roughly where we are now. So there's no sign that immigration is going away. And you can see the impact of this on the UK population has been really quite dramatic. Indeed, it is actually quite extraordinary. So from a period when the foreign-born population of the UK workforce had bobbled around on a slight but fairly gentle upward trend, 7 to 9% of the workforce. Since then, it's basically doubled to about 17% of the workforce. And it is actually quite extraordinary. And in some ways, I mean, immigration is the #1 political issue in the country at the moment. But in some ways, given that the UK has gone through periodic political panics about immigration before, it's quite surprising to look back and realize that there were people around here who were panicking about immigration, even about a few tens of thousands of people coming from East Africa at that point. It's actually, in some ways, a tribute to the resilience of the British economy and polity that we've only begun to enter into this particular panic when we get up at this level. So what have we learned then about, so I think I've tried to explain how policy has developed and changed and how that has impacted on immigration flows very briefly. What have we learned in the last 10 years about the impacts of that on the UK? I mean, most economists tend to take the view that economic migration, at least, is likely to be beneficial. We tend to take that view for much the same reasons that we think free trade is a good thing. Because on the whole, we think that people will tend to, economic agents, respond to incentives, respond to opportunities, maximize welfare, and if you allow resources, whether that's human or anything else, to flow to the places where they will maximize returns, that on the whole is going to be good for everybody. That's a very simplistic Adam Smith Econ 101 view of the world, but that's sort of where we get our basic instincts from. And hence, the view of the benefits of migration have tended to be largely based on both on that theory, in a more or less sophisticated version, and anecdote. So the first significant econometric analysis of labour market impacts was again undertaken by Christian Dustman at UCL back in the early 2000s, and found no significant negative impacts of immigration on the labour market outcomes of British nationals. In other words, there was no negative impact on employment. Immigrants didn't take British people's jobs. And that sort of became the conventional wisdom, and I'll say a bit more in a moment. Unfortunately, however, we don't have a proper program evaluation of any of the programs that I mentioned above, work permit, the high-skilled migrant program, post-study work route. We don't really have a sense of how individual groups of immigrants or people who came from different routes have impacted on the UK economy. And then after 2004, and after the big upsurge that accompanied with the arrival of these Europeans, there was a huge upsurge in econometric analysis of the labour market impacts of immigration. And I've just listed some of those papers, a couple of them are mine, but they range across the spectrum. There have also been several reports by the Migration Advisory Committee, and I know there's a member of the Migration Advisory Committee on the faculty here somewhere. There she is. The Migration Advisory Committee is a committee mostly of economists or people in related fields which provides independent advice to the government on aspects of immigration policy. And so what is the bottom line of all of this research? Well, this is the chart from one of my papers, but actually some version of it occurs in most papers. So this looks at this takes each local authority in the UK and measures the change in the number of immigrants over a particular period, measured as a percentage of the working age population. So as you go from right to left, you have a lot of local authorities where there aren't that many immigrants, and then a scatter here of local authorities where there are really quite a lot of immigrants, and then somewhere in here in the middle where there are significant immigration but not huge, so 4, 5, 6, 8, 10% of the population. And this looks at changes in the claimant count, which is one measure of unemployment, the number of people claiming unemployment benefit in those particular areas. And what you can see there is that there is essentially no relationship. Places with more immigrants didn't see a larger rise in unemployment on average than places with fewer immigrants. And that is a very simplistic chart and a very simplistic way of looking at the issue. There are lots of other things going on at the same time. You would expect immigrants to go to places which have healthier labour markets and so on. But what I think can be said is that subjecting these data sets and various other versions of these data sets to fairly sophisticated econometric analysis still leads you to essentially the same result, that there's no significant impact of immigration on native employment or unemployment, which is quite a strong result and not one that we would necessarily have expected. In short, as far as we can tell, immigrants don't take our jobs. And that's quite important. I mean, it's a fairly simplistic and simple statement. It's quite a powerful one, quite an important one in the political debate. And so, where do we stand then from all these papers? I think there's actually, although immigration is a very hotly disputed topic in the political debate, there's a remarkable degree of consensus among labour market economists about the short-term impacts of immigration in the UK. Some good summaries have been produced, in particular by Jennifer's colleague Jonathon Wadsworth, also on the Migration Advisory Committee, who's at Royal Holloway and LSE, and also by the people at UCL. That immigration to the UK, on average and in aggregate, has little or no impact on unemployment. If there is an impact, it's quite small and quite difficult to detect. That immigration probably has some small negative impact on wages at the bottom of the distribution, but little or no impact on wages overall. But here it has to be said there's relatively little up-to-date research, and probably something we need more of. There's also been a reasonable amount of research on the impact of immigration on public services. And here, one thing we know fairly clearly is that despite the Prime Minister's speech last week, benefit tourism, the idea that immigrants come here specifically to claim benefits or are attracted by the generous benefit system, is pretty much completely a myth. That's not to say that immigrants don't claim benefits. Some of them do, of course, usually after they've been in this country a while, but it's not the reason they claim. That the impact on public services, health, education, and so on, is certainly significant in some areas, in particular those areas where immigrants are highly concentrated, but it's often exaggerated. And that the fiscal impacts are probably positive, but not huge in comparison to the economy as a whole. There's also been a couple of recent analyses of the long-term impact, fiscal impacts of immigration on the economy, which is in some ways is a more interesting question, because it's quite rightly pointed out that immigrants tend, like the rest of us, do get old, so measuring simply a snapshot is not enough to say what the long-term impact of immigration are on the public finances. But some simulations done both by my colleague Katerina Lysenkova at NISA and also by the Government's Office of Budget Responsibility suggest that at least as far ahead as you can project reasonably, so 10, 20, 30, 50 years, the fiscal impacts of immigration are positive and significant but not huge in the great scheme of things. And I think this coincides with what most economists would probably instinctively guess, that immigration makes the challenge of funding the welfare state, the challenge of dealing with an aging society, somewhat easier to deal with, but doesn't in itself solve the problem or anything like solve the problem. We'll still have to confront the problems with financing our welfare state, even with high levels of immigration. But immigration will make making that transition rather easier. But in some sense, and this is perhaps I think the most interesting set of questions going forward, the short-term labour market impacts of immigration and the short-term impacts of immigration on things like public services and the public finances are perhaps not the most interesting type of question that can be asked about the economic impacts of immigration. Maybe the easiest type of question for us to answer, but they're not the only set of questions by any means. Because immigrants and immigration doesn't affect the UK economy just because we have more people here, perhaps with slightly different levels of education and skills, and perhaps choosing to concentrate themselves in slightly different places, which are the sort of questions that short-term labour market analyses tend to address. Immigration is likely to have considerably more complicated and difficult to interpret impacts on the shape of the economy. And I'm not going to try and go through each of these and say precisely what the mechanisms are, but just to pick out a few. In particular, immigrants are likely to bring different sets of skills and experience, not just in terms of different levels of education, but different types of education, different types of knowledge. That in turn is likely to have spillover effects within firms and within society as a whole. Those might be large or small, they might be positive or negative, we don't know. But immigrants are likely to come here in part because they are different, both from us and from the country, from the other people in the countries that they can do. So what impact does a significant impact of influx of people who weren't born here, weren't necessarily educated here, what impact does that have on how both our economy and society works? Immigration may facilitate or may be a substitute or a complement to, but most of the research says it's more likely to be a complement to international trade and the international flow of ideas in one way or another, both through transactional networks, both within companies and outside companies. Immigration may also result in segmented labour markets, and that's something where one can imagine the impact might be positive or negative. There are certainly serious public concern in this country now that in some sectors and occupations you can't get a job unless you're an immigrant. You can't get a job unless you speak Polish if you want to work in a sandwich factory in Nottingham. Now, this may be exaggerated, but there's probably a grain of truth to it. And there are certainly, it is not hard. I walk around London every day. London is an incredibly diverse city, and there are lots of workplaces like mine which have very diverse workforces. On the other hand, there are certain labour markets in certain segments which are very clearly dominated by certain nationalities. That may or may not be a good thing. It rather depends on what happens next. It rather depends on whether people get stuck in those areas, whether those sectors become the preserve of low-wage immigrants working in unskilled low-wage employment with no incentive on employers to train, develop people, pay better wages, modernise, or the rest of it, or whether they become a ladder out, and we don't know yet. So there are a whole host of issues there which are worth looking at, and there is beginning to be some research on these areas, some here and some in other countries. So, for example, Jennifer Hunt and others in the US have looked at the impact of immigration on innovation and patents, the impact on native educational performance. Cinzia Rienzo and NISA has looked at the impact on productivity within firms. One particularly interesting area, in my view, has been the recent upsurge in research on London schools. So London schools have been one of the big social policy success stories in the UK for the last 10 years. They've hugely outperformed the rest of the country, and nobody is quite sure why. Most people think it probably does have something to do with immigration, but there are reputable researchers on all sides here, Sandra McNally at the Institute of Education, Simon Burgess at Bristol, who have quite different analyses of quite what the impact of immigration is, what the causal mechanisms are, and to what extent we might expect to see it replicated in the rest of the country. And I think it's encouraging, it's mostly a positive story, because what's happened in London clearly is a positive story. And we still don't really know what's going on. There's been some research again by at NISA by my colleague Max Nathan on diversity and patenting and growth within cities. And then at a more macro level, people have looked at, across countries at the impact of immigration on things like growth and total factor productivity. Well, I think one of the interesting things is that so far none of this, a lot of this evidence is very interesting, a lot of it is very suggestive. None of it is very conclusive. And there is certainly nothing like the same, as I said, I think there is a broad consensus among labour market economists about the short-term impacts of immigration on the UK labour market. It's a relatively positive story, but is not a terribly dramatic one. For these questions, for the broader invasive immigration, there is nothing like a consensus on any of these individual items, let alone across the piece. And so there are a huge set of questions still to be asked. And these perhaps, I think, if you're trying to look at to get beyond the sort of short-term worries about immigrants coming and taking our jobs, and trying to formulate a longer-term strategy for what part does immigration policy play in the UK's broader strategy of covering a relatively successful small open economy. How do we maintain, preserve, and extend that? These are perhaps the more interesting questions. So I think I'm going to stop it there. I haven't talked about the immigration policy in the context of the UK election debate coming up, because my time has run out. I think I suspect some people will ask me questions about that anyway. But clearly immigration policy will continue to be at the centre of the political debate, and hence I hope it will continue to be at the centre of research agenda for economists. I think, on the whole, I think actually economists have a good story to tell here. We have gone from having hardly anybody in this country working really on the economics of immigration 15 years ago, having a thriving research agenda, and one which, for better or worse, is taken very seriously by policymakers. It's an area where economists, political scientists, and people working across those disciplines can potentially have a real impact on policy, have had an impact on policy, and can, I hope, have a positive impact on policy going forward.
Jonathan, thanks a lot. Very much. Stimulating. So we have time. We have about 20 minutes for questions from the floor. So just put your hand up, and lots of hands will go up, and I'll have to select. Make my job harder. So I'll come to Jennifer in a minute, but let me say student hands before staff members. Jennifer is a member of, as you also pointed out, Home Office's Migration Advisory Committee. So who wants to ask a question of Jonathan on what he talked about or something related? My colleagues want to ask questions. I'm going to tell them to wait. Well, they can kick off. Okay, Jennifer, why don't you kick off?
Okay, Jonathan, taking it as given that there is some negative impact of migrants at the lower end of the labour market on wages, do you think that that is a problem? And if so, what policies should the government pursue to alleviate it?
Okay, so taking given there is some negative impact, is that a problem? Well, obviously, if we care about inequality and the shape of the earnings distribution, particularly at the lower end, and most, if not all, politicians do, and certainly a large part of the public does, then clearly it's a problem. What should we do about it? Well, I tend to take as an analogy in this the experience of the UK with coal mining back in the 1980s. We took a policy decision to expose coal mines to international competition. The result was clearly, in my view, positive for the UK economy as a whole. It was clearly very negative for coal mines and for coal miners, and indeed the communities that coal miners lived in. That doesn't mean it was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. And indeed, no serious politician suggests that we should try and recreate a coal mining industry in this country. Now you can argue, and I would broadly agree, that we didn't do enough to alleviate the social consequences of that decision. It doesn't mean it was the wrong decision. So I think the first thing I would conclude is to say that just because immigration, like trade, can lead to things which we think of as problems, doesn't mean that the answer is to be restrictive about immigration policy any more than the answer is to be restrictive about trade policy. The second thing, I think, which I think is important from a political point of view, is to say that, frankly, the consequences were far worse for the coal miners than they are for people competing with immigrants. We know what happened to some coal mining communities. As you know, the impact of immigration on wages and employment at the lower end is probably there, but it's not huge, and there's lots of other things going on, and pinpointing the effect on individuals or areas is actually quite hard. So in some ways, the coal mining example is much more dramatic. The third thing I say in terms of specific policies is that we know that it is the case now, and it was, but it has always been the case, but probably even more the case now, that not having skills, qualifications, aptitudes towards work or so on is a really serious disadvantage in the UK labour market. You're not going to get very far in this country now if you don't have some qualifications and a knowledge of how to connect those qualifications with the labour market. That was probably true 15 years ago. It's certainly more true now. And one of the reasons it may be more true is immigration, the supply of educated, motivated people from elsewhere. But there's other things going on as well. And whatever you think are the main drivers, the answer, the policy answer, is to get that right. The policy answer is to ensure that people in this country leave school, further education, university, with both a decent set of qualifications, basic skills in things like maths, English, and the ability to analyse complex problems, and the motivation to apply those in the workplace.
Okay, let's see whether we have a question from the student. Because go ahead.
Hello, I'm wondering when the empirical evidence shows that immigration has such a positive impact on the British economy and the in fiscal issues and so on, why is it such a big issue in British politics?
Well, this of course is the subject of many a political science thesis. I think one thing that is interesting is that there's no obvious correlation between concern about immigration and the state of the economic cycle. People often make this rather easy thing. They say, well, the economy's bad, therefore people blame immigrants. But that doesn't really appear to be true in British politics. It's not actually the case that concern in immigration is always at its height when the economy's bad. And in fact, of course, the economy was considerably worse 3 years ago than it is now, and yet concern on immigration has if anything, intensified. So there's one negative answer, I think, to say it's not just about economics. I think one thing which is also observable in the data is that it's by no means places where, to the extent the concern about immigration is concentrated, it's by no means concentrated in the places that where there are most immigrants. It's notable that the two recent by-elections won by UKIP, to a large extent on an anti-immigration platform, were in areas which have significantly lower than average levels of immigration. But I think there probably is something there. So Clacton, where UKIP, of course, it is quite an interesting case. It has very low levels of immigration. It has low wages, has a population who are relatively low qualified. It has very high levels of benefit received. So what does all that tell you? Well, it's not directly immigration, but there is something there about a sense of being left behind, particularly as the economy is recovering. Well, the economy in London is recovering. The economy in London has recovered. The economy in London is doing wonderfully, as indeed the economies in a number of provincial cities as well, York, Cambridge, and so on. The economy in Clacton is not doing very well, and that relates partly to what I was saying to Jennifer just now. We're not, there are a lot of kids or people in Clacton who don't have terribly marketable skills, and it's possible, but this is just a hypothesis, they look at what's happening in London and think, well, there are a lot of successful, very rich people in London. There are a lot of very rich immigrants in London. There are also a lot of relatively poor immigrants who've come to London who have taken the jobs that maybe I think I ought to be able to take. So there is maybe something around that, a feeling excluded by the relatively successful parts of the economy. But that's just a hypothesis. I don't have terribly strong evidence.
Thanks. Yep, go ahead.
You were talking about the impact on public services of immigration, and what would you say is the impact on public funding schools? And because from my point of view, we can say immigration has benefits, but we should accept that in order to be the society to be prosperous and inclusive, you should spend more on public funded schools in order to make the society better in the long term. So what the research says.
Well, as I was saying, I mean, I think, you know, clearly immigration immigration, and in particular immigrants who come here and have children. I mean, the number of people who immigrate here as children is actually relatively low, but there has been a significant upsurge in babies being born here to immigrant children, and clearly that increases pressure on schools. They just simply need to have more schools, and we do, as a consequence, in part of immigration, need to have more schools. So there's one question there is just about the overall fiscal balance, and most of the evidence suggests that the immigrants pay more than enough in taxes to cover the cost of those schools. So it's simply a question of making sure the money finds its way into the schools. That's the sort of easy part. The more difficult part is, well, what impact do the immigrants have on the education system more widely? As I said there, to I think many people's considerable surprise, the evidence is surprisingly positive. So we have, as I said, this quite remarkable improvement in the quality of London schools relative to the rest of the country over the last 15 years. London is now, I believe, the only capital city in the developed world where the school performance is better than the country as a whole. Poor children in London do about as well as the average child in the country as a whole, which is, whereas the average poor child anywhere else in the country does much, much worse. Now, as I said, we don't know the extent to which, how immigration feeds into that. But so far, at least, it does seem like the story is surprisingly positive. That there not only do the children of immigrants seem to perform okay, but it doesn't seem to have any negative impacts on other children who happen to be in the same area or sharing the same school.
Thanks. You had a question?
Yeah, just wondering, I've missed some things like this. Do you mention the impact of the immigration or taxation?
Yes, so I mean, the immigrants pay taxes and they consume public services, so they are both a cost and a benefit. Overall, I mean, this is a hotly disputed topic because it depends a lot on exactly what you count and how you measure. But my reading is that at least recent immigrants have tended to make a positive contribution. They tend to pay more in tax. And then over the long term, most simulations suggest that the impact is positive. But it's not huge. It's not it's probably relatively small compared to other things going on.
Right.
I want to know what would your opinion be on bringing back the post-study work group?
Well, I think, personally, I think abolishing the post-study work was probably the single biggest policy mistake the government made. It was clearly being abused by some institutions and some individual students, and it was probably somewhat too generous. But we've swung far too far the other way. It seems fairly obvious to me that there are quite significant benefits and relatively little risks in some liberalisation of the post-study work group. And my guess actually is that the next government probably will liberalise it again to some extent.
Okay. Good, yeah.
I don't know if you already mentioned it, but I was just wondering, what do you think the extent and the impact is of illegal immigration in the UK, and what policies we put in place?
As you know, it's very difficult to estimate illegal immigration. The most recent estimates, which are a little bit out of date, were done by some people at LSE, which come up with numbers in the sort of 600,000 or 700,000 range. So that's about 1.1% of the overall population. Which is significant, but pretty small compared to, say, the US, where it's estimated being closer to 3.5% of the population. And it's you know, that coincides with common sense, frankly, having lived in New York for a long time, where basically every other person you met who was doing some form of unskilled job was almost certainly in the country illegally. That's just not true in London. The vast majority of people are here legally. My guess is that if anything, the illegal population is probably reduced since those estimates were made, because there has been some shift in immigration towards people coming from Eastern Europe, who by definition aren't illegal, away from, and so for example last year, the Bulgarians and Romanians who might have been working here illegally no longer are. They're working here illegally. There's also been a couple of effectively amnesties for people whose asylum seekers primarily, whose files got lost in the system. So we've legalised some more people. It clearly is an issue and does lead, and there probably is a reasonable amount of illegal immigration, again concentrated in some sectors and areas, but it's not a sort of big macro level problem the way it is, say, in the United States.
Okay, so go ahead, yeah.
You say that immigration is one of the biggest issues in politics at the moment, which I have to agree with. And then also that the most of the presentation in your answer to the question about that actually the issues with immigration aren't really grounded in much factual evidence. So would you be more wary of a lack of action by political parties to do with immigration, or do you think that action on the wrong basis, sort of following UKIP sort of lines, do you think that would be more dangerous?
Well, I think there's clearly a very serious danger that we will do stupid things as a consequence of some fairly irrational discussion. So, without expressing a view on the sort of wider issues of the UK's membership of the European Union, which is a much bigger and a much wider and more complicated subject, and there are lots of other issues there, political and otherwise. I do think it would be very odd, to say the least, if the UK decided to leave the European Union because of immigration or because of free movement of workers within the European Union. That would strike me as a very irrational thing to do. I don't think it's likely, but it's certainly not impossible given the way the debate is going now. I mean, it's quite interesting that a couple of years ago, the Prime Minister said he wanted to renegotiate the UK's relationship with the EU, and he had a whole list of demands, some of which were in many respects quite sensible, I thought, and well worth talking about in Brussels. Those all seem to have been dropped now. Apparently the only thing we care about now in our relationship with the European Union is immigration, and that seems to me to be completely mad.
Okay, look, we're going to take one more. We're going to let Marcus, Professor Miller, who's going to ask a question, and I'm going to let him do that. Is that okay with you? This is the Professor of the department. And I'll allow with a final question from one of the students. So start thinking whether you want to ask Jonathan with a harder question which you cannot answer. So while you're thinking about that, Marcus.
You give us a very good survey of the evidence on immigration to the UK, which is surprisingly different about America. America is built on immigration. So can't we see some of the long-run effects by looking at American experience?
Well, I guess, we see some of the very, very long-run effects, I guess, because obviously everyone in America more or less is an immigrant to an extent. So it certainly tells you, at one level, well, it's possible to construct a very successful economy on the basis purely of immigration. What does that tell you about the UK? I'm not sure. I think a lot of the recent economic debate in the US about immigration has been focused on particularly around wage and employment effects at the lower end, resulting from a very, very large influx of irregular migrants from Mexico and Central America. And in some sense, I'm not sure that's a terribly, in some ways, that is, and hence the policy debate in the US is now very much focused on what to do about this very large stock of irregular migrants. And those are very important and interesting debates. If you're American, I'm not sure they really tell us that much about the UK. And I think the general point that immigrant-based societies can be successful is clearly true. But again, what does that tell you about the UK, where this island wasn't that empty or populated only by the natives 300 or 400 years ago? I mean, there are some very general lessons, and I think some of the individual level studies around things like innovation or patenting or the impact of students are relevant, but I'm not sure that it tells you that much at the macro level.
Okay, we've got time for one final question if anyone wants to ask that. Go ahead, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'm from Singapore, and well, in my country, almost one in every person is foreign, and our stories are somewhat similar too, in the sense that we to rapid liberalization in 2005. The formal population is more vulnerable, and then recently there's some to that equivalent. One of the reasons, as well from a macroeconomic perspective, is that we found that massive labor intake is actually dampening labor productivity just because the relative price of labor is cheaper. So is there any link between labor inflows and labor productivity?
That's a very good question, and obviously it could go both ways. Immigrants could raise labor productivity or lower it. As I said, some recent work by Cinzia Rienzo at NISA found that at a very high level there was a positive correlation between immigrant shares in sector regions and productivity. The evidence for dampening labour productivity at a macro level didn't appear to be strong. If anything, it appeared to be going the other way. On the other hand, I think the one obvious counter to that is say, well, immigrants, the productivity impact of immigrants is likely to be very different. So obviously, if you have a significant impact of low-wage, low-skilled immigrants, even just as an arithmetic question, that's going to have a different impact on productivity to an influx of high-skilled, high-qualified immigrants. And then, of course, you have second-order effects. So it's quite possible to argue that low-skilled workers are low productivity in themselves, but by taking away the low productivity tasks from other high-skilled workers, native or native or foreign, they enable greater productivity and growth elsewhere. So the short answer is, it's an interesting and complicated question. There is not strong evidence either way for the UK, and it almost certainly depends on which immigrants and in what sectors.
So look, this is we'll draw this bit to a close. Jonathan is still with us for another half an hour or so, or a glass of wine. So at this point, I think let's just a big thank you for Jonathan for giving us